Welcome to Fleshy Courts University. This evening we shall be discussing the novel Ushoran Mortarch of Delusion by Dale Lucas. We'll be going over the good, the bad, and the FECly in a review of the book. I hope you've all done your assigned reading. If not, warning, some spoilers ahead. Dale Lucas has written a number of novels for the Black Library, God's Bane probably being the largest of them, and his most recent work published through them is Ushoran Mortarch of Delusion. I will say, from doing a little bit of writing myself, working on the editing process, working with editors, any written work should be respected. A lot of heart, a lot of soul goes into it. However, in a review, we look at all of the different parts of it, both the good and the bad, and the FECly, those things we enjoyed, those things maybe not so much or could have had some work on it, and how it applies to the Flesh Eater Courts and the Flesh Eater Courts community. Without further ado, let's dive in. First things first, it is a Flesh Eater Courts novel. The Flesh Eater Courts, not often featured in books, especially as anything more than a support character or a support army, if you will. Kind of a nameless baddie, some stormtroopers, some orcs that can just be slaughtered. So having a novel in which we are focused on, we are seen as a little bit more of a character instead of just an object, is wonderful. That's great. All Flesh Eater Courts players, rejoice. There's a book for us. In my personal opinion, I was a little lukewarm about the novel as a whole. But the reviews were fairly high, and I can see why. Act 3 has beautiful pacing, wonderful action, and a just amazing narrative and story. But it's only that end 1/3 of the book really that kind of grabs you. It does leave you with a very good taste in the mouth, however, which I think would be my explanation for its very high ratings. It is good to have more Age of Sigmar content. Good to have more novels about the army that you're passionate about. But that might be about where the good list stops. The first thing is something that is kind of a general problem with Flesh Eater Courts in novels, in a lot of the media and the short stories that Games Workshop produces, which is that they don't feel as though FEC can carry the story on their own. This is not an Ushoran novel, which is probably my biggest beef, my largest giblet to pick with this book, is the fact that the book really isn't about Ushoran. There are 9 chapters in this book, and 3 interludes. The interludes follow Ushoran. All other chapters follow a noble by the name of Casimir. This is a Casimir novel. It is a Sigmar novel with a little bit of Flesh Eater Court focus on it. I understand that there is a concern, that there is a worry with any of the quote-unquote Xenos factions in either Warhammer or Warhammer 40k, that you're going to have a hard time having your audience connect to your protagonist if they are too alien. The German concept of the Umwelt, the idea that we cannot fully experience another being's experiences, creates this hardline barrier between the protagonist of a non-human faction and the reader. However, in Flesh Eater Courts, they are human. They have soul and emotion. They have wants and desires. They're just under delusion. And I think that you could get away just writing about a Flesh Eater Courts character. You get a little bit of a bait and switch with this book. It's titled Ushoran Mortarch of Delusion. It really doesn't have him being a Mortarch. It really doesn't talk about his delusion that much, and more on that later. It's a very interesting presentation of the delusion in general. But you do have this bait and switch in characters, and it's a lot like some of the modern current media, a Hawkeye TV show. But really, it's more about Hawkeye's apprentice. A movie that's entitled with one main character, but really they're trying to introduce another. And it leaves the reader with this feeling a bit of betrayal. There's so much to the character of Ushoran that could be explored, having been hinted at now for, 8 years, and only now having a model in the last 2. Having an actual Ushoran tale would have been delightful. Another point that I struggle with a little bit in Mr. Lucas's writing is he does seem to do an awful lot of tell, don't show. Much of this is in the character development with Kosimir in the early parts of the book, relating to his experiences with his family, primarily with his mother, instead of taking time in the novel to demonstrate his feelings of inadequacy, his feelings of distrust with a lot of the individuals of his court. We're sort of told in a lot of these. I thought that this was a very, very apt demonstration, where when speaking about a member of the Free Guild Guard, he wants us to know that she is female, and states, the captain, female, her face long and slender. You could have cut out female right there. The captain, her face long and slender, already tells us that this is a woman. But there's this distrust of the reader to understand and fully comprehend the details that you're wanting to bring out, and you get more of that tell, don't show. This tends to go away in that third act. Again, I don't know if this is more of Mr. Lucas's preference for one writing style over the other. The book definitely goes from quite frankly, just a historical fiction in the beginning, similar akin to like The Last Kingdom, but to more of a true horror novel at the end. And you can feel when you're reading it, at the pace of action, at the way in which detail is communicated, that the author had a lot more fun with part 3 than parts 1 and 2. If you disagree, please let me know, but I think that everyone's going to find that that's the case. I also got a very aged sense from this book. Not aged necessarily in it's an ancient tome full of myth and what have you, but that this book was written a long time ago and has been sitting on the shelf or in the back room ready for launch for quite some time. The units or the troops or the persons that they refer to in all of the Cities of Sigmar chapters, they talk very briefly about Dawnbringers, Dawn Crusade, Dawners, what have you. But primarily they talk about Free Guild, and they talk about Duardin artillery, really pulling back to the old units that are left over from the Empire, from Warhammer Fantasy, that were brought into Age of Sigmar, as opposed to looking at a lot of their newer units. Even to the point of using terms like Art Lector in there, which is very antiquated as far as looking at Warhammer Fantasy versus Age of Sigmar. Very, very strange, very odd. In the Flesh Eater Court's roster of things, it's really just ghouls. There's maybe one reference to a crypt horror during one of the fight scenes, but it could also just be a larger ghoul or maybe some sort of like quasi-abhorrent. Another strange thing, usually in these Black Library novels, when they are portraying a model, especially a new model, in a book, they try to grab every little detail off of it. And something that is not mentioned once in the entirety of this novel is Ushoran's mace. It almost seems as though maybe some work in progress art was shared with the author, or a general description, but he's completely unarmed this entire time, which is atypical for Black Library. Very, very, very strange. Again, making me think that this novel was worked on and written far before the new model range in the next Flesh Eater Court's book was sort of finalized. The last bit of it that seems really dated to me is that I do get a very big pandemic sense and mentality and feeling towards the end, which makes sense. You're talking about a siege, you're talking about isolation, but they really are treating the Flesh Eater Court's Curse a lot more as a zombie movie, like a generic Nurgle or zombie sort of feel to it, versus a psychological curse. They talk about, have you been bitten? Have you come in contact with them? It seems a little bit strange. We'll go over that in the FECly and how this applies to the flesh-eater courts in general. But it did give a very strong pandemic vibe where you had individuals arguing that, oh no, we should go into the world, and you had the government and ruling parties saying, no, we need to isolate, which I think would fit with that timeline of being a little bit pre-Cities of Sigmar, big release. We're still in development for the Ushoran model. It gave a little bit of an antiquated feel. It feels like this book should have been released with the Flesh-Eater Court's original release. And even then, it might have felt like a little bit old. So I don't know what happened. Maybe something got held up on production and slowed this down a bit. The last small gripe that I have on the book is that it's incredibly low fantasy. You could replace the setting with anywhere in The Witcher, Song of Ice and Fire. They try to tie in some of the amazing lore and fantasy that we get in the Mortal Realms through things like referring to Shaishian spider silk, or instead of calling it wine, it's, death vine wine, or small little things. But there's no magic in the world. Shaiish is a very fascinating realm because each of the land masses are supposed to be an underworld from some sort of populace across the Mortal Realms. Wherever this takes place seems to be the thought that you die and you go to Poland, where they have winter and it's windy sometimes. There's no magic to it. In Ghoul Slayer, we talk about souls coming back as moths in this world. It's the Neferata book. There's the up and down split level. Do you go up here with your soul, or do you go down here? And there are souls siphoning. There's so much that you can do with Shaiish, and they just sort of skip it over. They toss in a little bit of Stormcast, there's a little bit of Aqua Gyranus, but it's really nothing more than you could find in, say, Bernard Cornwell's The Winter King, where they have splashes of magic. It makes it very low fantasy, and it makes it feel like, again, it is not a Age of Sigmar, and especially not a Flesh-Eater Courts novel. This feels more like a sort of generic medieval zombie story. And finally, let's talk about the FECly. Where does this apply to Flesh-Eater Courts players, to the lore of the Flesh-Eater Courts? What have we added through this novel? The first one that I want to talk about a little bit is the presentation of the delusion in this book. It's a little strange. Oftentimes, in, let's say, Ghoul Slayer, for instance, or even just in the army books in general, you have this concept of this full delusion in which the individuals see themselves as Bretonnia, if we're being honest, or as medieval nobles and peasants and what have you. You have this full sort of rewriting of the world through their eyes, where you might see a corpse and they see a soldier. You might see a broken barn and they see a castle fortress. But that seems to be gone in this novel, which I think adds to that low fantasy and that lack of Age of Sigmar feeling a little bit. Instead, we get this sort of muted delusion. And at first I thought that it was just through the eyes of Ushoran, which, you could make an argument for. Definitely in the Harbinger book series, they kind of play at Ushoran seeing and understanding the delusion a little bit more than your average little Fecture. But he seems to, instead of seeing the world as this great and wondrous place, instead of the horrors of cannibalism and dilapidated courts, he seems to just see that, yes, these things are happening, but this is okay and this is good. It's more of a like an ethical or a moral delusion versus a true what we call like a bizarre delusion in which the world is not as we perceive it. It comes off very odd, and especially in the individuals that are turning, they're not detached from the world. This is also, I think, our first instance of individuals other than Ushoran himself and maybe Judge Gormain, perhaps the Marrow Heralds, speaking the common tongue, whatever that language might be, Shaiishi or what have you, with people. Usually, once you're in the delusion, you can no longer communicate with people. Again, unless you're Gormain, who has a special case of the delusion. Ushoran, obviously the most special case of the delusion. And perhaps Marrow Heralds, but I think that they pull whoever they're talking to into the delusion enough that they deliver the message as, a brilliant herald in fine garb, long enough for them to at least accept, the bound, and then they figure out whether or not they reject it in their mind. But you get these individuals that have been infected, again, very zombie-like versus the delusion that we've seen in other works of literature from Games Workshop. They seem to be able to just freely communicate, and they talk back and forth. And they are in this weird, soupy half-delusion where they understand what's going on. They know they're in prison. They know that they're, in rags. They know that they're cannibals, but that's okay. That's fine. And I don't like that presentation of the delusion. Quite frankly, I think that it's very low fantasy. It's much more of like a political commentary than like this true vampiric magical madness that is spreading across the world. So just a very odd take on that. For any of you Flesh Eater Quartz fans who have given this a read, please comment down below. I'd love to chat with you on that sort of perception of the delusion, because it just seemed very odd to me. Small thing brought in there. Ushoran talks about a new heir being born to an abhorrent. What does that mean? We never know. We never get to explore that. Another missed opportunity. Does that mean, hey, this abhorrent that was in charge of this court has chosen to make a new abhorrent, through the ritual of blood kiss, whatever it is that vampires do? Or does he legitimately have an heir, have a child? Can abhorrents reproduce? Flesh Eater Quartz are always in this weird dead versus undead limbo compared to much of the others. We do know that Ushoran is a soul-blight grave lord. He's a vampire, for lack of copyrighted terms. But is there something strange with his curse that the Flesh Eater Quartz are able to have children? We don't know. Weird, fun little thing that was dangled out there. We'll see if they go anywhere with it. A final thing that I thought would be very interesting, just as far as lore goes for Flesh Eater Quartz enjoyers. It's titled Ushoran Mortarch of Delusion. He doesn't really Mortarch at all. There's no talking with Nagash. I think Old Bones is referenced a few times. But there's a very interesting presentation of the Mortarchs from the point of view of the humans, of the Sigmarites and what have you. There's a point in which they are poking fun at Manfred. They all seem to be aware that Manfred exists. And in a world that does not have social media or mass-produced print, they all know what Manfred looks like and are able to recognize a caricature of him, a costume done to look like Manfred, Mortarch of Night, which is an interesting thought, really. You have a medieval society that is across this giant realm, chain of islands essentially in Shaiish, but the people either have paintings and portraits readily available everywhere of the Mortarch of Night, who I don't believe that he is on this particular underworld continent in Shaiish, or the Mortarchs get around enough that the people generationally can see and identify him. It's an interesting historical sort of a take, right? Like, you have to step out of our modern age in which someone comes up on the news and we all know who they are and what they look like because photography is so readily available. If you go back to the Middle Ages, it's why we used heraldry. It's why Flesh Eater Quartz fly banners on their Morbeg nights, is because a symbol was a much more static and readily recognizable thing to represent an individual versus their actual visage, right? If I shave off my beard and get a haircut, I will look totally different. But if I keep my heraldic device and I carry that on my shield wherever I go, then regardless of what happens here, you'll be able to recognize me on the field. And it just made for a very interesting concept. I'm sure that they meant nothing by it. I'm sure it's meant to be sort of a throwaway little side deal. But it's an interesting idea, is it not? That these Mortarchs are recognizable enough. Ushoran is referred to as the Winter King, which is a really fun Arthurian sort of reference. But he's at least known enough in story and legend from way back when that people talk about him. But his physical description is not agreed upon or known by the individuals in the tavern and the feasting halls and what have you throughout this novel. Whereas Manfred, apparently, they make postage stamps of Manfred or something. Everyone knows what Manfred looks like. Recognize him from a poorly made costume. I don't know if you've ever tried to make a leather mask or helmet before, but it's really hard to get fine detail in that 3D space on something that you're going to wear. So the fact that everyone could look at that and go, that's Manfred, is fascinating. With that ends this course, our Fecture 1003 review of Ushoran Mortarch of Delusion. Overall, I did enjoy the book in the end of it, right? The final act is Chef's Kiss. It is delightful. It is written in a compelling way. But parts 1 and 2 drug on for me, and I was just disappointed by the fact that this was a Cities of Sigmar novel instead of a Flesh-Eater Courts novel. If I, had to give it an old stars rating or what have you, I'd hover somewhere between a 2 and a 3. Again, nothing against Dale Lucas. I have not read Godsbane, but I have heard very good things about it and its development of the lore. But for this one, I will say it's a little bit of a letdown for a faction that gets so little focus in these sort of pieces of media and literature. For instance, like Idoneth Deepkin fans, if an IDK book came out, it was Methalea? The new Methalea model got her own novel, right? And if you went, you bought the book, you cracked it open, and you found out that it was actually just, let's see here, 100, 200, about 250 pages about Fire Slayers with 3 interludes that talked a little bit about IDK, I think you'd be disappointed too. Anyway, thank you all for tuning in. This has been Flesh-Eater Courts University.